Thank you. Thank you very much. Uh, it is a pleasure to be here, although also very sad to not actually be with you all. And I thought I would start by bringing you really into my life and giving you the text message conversation that I had with my wife while sitting on the plane in Washington, D.C. before realizing it was not going to happen. So a glimpse into my reality from Wednesday night. But I'm glad I'm able to come in virtually and still deliver this talk. So let's dig into it. Thank you very much for that introduction. I am with a company called The Ready. We call ourselves a future of work consultancy, sometimes an organizational change or organizational transformation consultancy, but basically we try to help organizations create a more meaningful, equitable, and human way of working across lots of different industries. So from, Sweet Green, which is salads, to charity water, the Federal Reserve Bank, charter, lots of different types of organizations. They tend to be quite large, though, and quite frustrated with the bureaucracy that they have created for themselves. So organizations can feel like black boxes, and let's just pretend this stock art that I found is of a black box and not a brown one. And they can also feel like immutable forces of nature. If you've ever worked in a large bureaucracy or really any type of organization, organizations can sometimes feel like they've always been around. It's never gonna, it kind of just appeared fully formed, and it is something that you can't really push against or change in any meaningful way. And what we do at The Ready, and what my goal is here today, is to give you some new lenses through which you can see the organizations you work for, or you work with, or you create for yourself, or have created for yourself. Because when you have new lenses that allow you to perceive organizations in new ways, it means you have unlocked new ways to actually change them. So the metaphor that came to me last night, sorry if this startles anyone, I think he's cute, but this bat here, I think sometimes walking around or trying to function within an organization can be like you are in a pitch black, very cluttered room, and you're just bumping into things left and right. It's hard to tell what is actually going on here. And my hope is that the information that I share with you today is going to be like giving you the power of echolocation, or organizational echolocation. So now you can start to see things a little bit differently than you may have in the past, and be able to navigate the organizational environment a little bit more skillfully, a little bit less painfully, and be able to influence it in positive ways. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history to kind of set the stage, and then get into some new ideas for thinking about organizations. So I like to start with this because it's very familiar to most folks. A traditional org chart with job titles and reporting lines and hierarchy. And I ask groups, and I won't do it here today just because the audio might not be great, but I ask groups, what year is this from? And I hear ranges from late 1800s to, this is probably the 1950s, or some people will be like, oh, this is today, or this is the reorg that's coming down the pipe next week. And it's very interesting to me that we can't really carbon date this kind of fundamental tool that we use to think about and visualize organizations and how humans come together to do work. The actual answer is that this is from 1910, so it's well over 100 years old, which is not to say that it's wrong or bad, but it's interesting that the kind of fundamental way that we generally draw organizations to conceptualize this thing we call organizations has largely remained unchanged for well over 100 years. And if I show you almost anything else from 1910, a car or a person or a shoe, you would say, oh yeah, I can tell, like that's very old. We have really leveled up the way we do things since 1910, and yet this really has not seen that similar upgrade. So again, not to say it's good or bad, but it should get us thinking about why that might be. So another kind of little pop quiz here is ask you to read this slide and ask yourself where these things come from. So insist on doing everything through channels. Don't permit shortcuts to be taken in order to expedite decisions. Refer back to matters decided upon at the last meeting and attempt to reopen the question of the advisability of that decision. For some of you, maybe this feels familiar. Maybe these are things that happen in organizations that you work for or work with. And that's interesting because this comes from the Simple Sabotage Field Manual, which was put out by the United States during World War II as a way to have folks who worked for Axis organizations, so factories, in Germany and others, these are basically ways to sabotage an organization without being obvious about it. So do these things and you'll grind your organization to a halt, and that'll help the Allied war effort. And somehow between then and now, a lot of these things have just become, everyday understanding of what it means to work in a organization. So that should be concerning, and probably more concerning than the old org chart that I showed it. So organizationally, we seem to really be grounded in some assumptions that are quite old. So from the industrial era and even from slave scenarios, a lot of the kind of basic management or basic assumptions about how organizations work assume that we are either on some sort of kind of assembly line and trying to as efficiently and as effectively crank out widgets, which for some organizations probably makes sense. But for a lot of organizations that really require human creativity and are operating in complexity and uncertain environments, maybe don't really map on to the work that actually has to be done. So I only put this forward to ask ourselves, well, what are we bringing forward from these older conceptualizations of work, of organizations? And are we okay with the things that we are pulling forward into 2023 and beyond? So every year, an organization called Gallup does a bunch of employee engagement surveys, and the numbers don't generally change a whole lot. They're generally pretty dour, pretty concerning. So you've got 48% of people unhappy in current job, 43% thinking about quitting, 51% not engaged, 16% actively disengaged. And actively disengaged is one of those euphemisms that actually mean basically people are trying to harm their organization. So 16% of most organizations, you've got people actively trying to harm organizations. And I'd be curious to know in the video game industry, in the gaming industry, what these numbers look like, if they're similar or different. And then just thinking about larger than just one individual organization, we see this general trend in organizations where we're seeing the return on assets going down over time generally. So it's just these are the productivity numbers that the media loves to talk about, generally going down over time. Basically, organizations are generating fewer returns for the same or more assets than in the past. And then I was thinking about you all and your environment, and I just typed in video game news into Google and went to the news tab and just kind of grabbed various headers that I saw going on here. And this is not news, I'm sure, to anybody, but the gaming industry has its own specific tensions and challenges that show everything is not rosy in the world of video games as well. And that's not casting aspersions on your industry, I could have probably typed in literally any industry, blank news, and gotten similar sorts of headlines across, various other types of organizations as well. So I'm really just trying to lay the foundation for there's some stuff going on here. The organizations as we have generally known them for 100 years or more seem to be having some troubles on the human side, on the financial return side, and it should just get us thinking about what's going on here. And we would argue that we have lots of things going on, but the one key idea that we play around with is this idea of organizational debt. So financial debt should be familiar to all of us. When you borrow money, you have to pay interest when paying it off. Technical debt, decisions that are made for short-term good reasons often end up needing to be paid down in the future. Organizational debt is similar, but you can think of it as the processes and the policies that accrue in organizations over time, often originally for maybe a good reason, but because most organizations don't really have a practice of paying down organizational debt, they just keep accruing on top of each other and on top of each other, and resulting in the bureaucracy that many of us experience in our organizations. So this org debt cycle that we see going on within organizations is that you have, you'll see there's two sides to this diagram here, but on the one hand, on the right hand side here, we have bureaucracy. So you've got people, leaders often trying to react to things that are going on in the organization with command and control. So we'll just tell you what to do, don't worry about it. Just do what we say and things will be fine, which results in a permission culture. So teams are not going to take initiative or use their judgment or take any sort of risk in an incredibly command and control sort of environment. So this results in a permission culture. You got to ask for permission before you can do anything, which leaves teams feeling generally pretty apathetic and stuck because they need permission before they can do anything, which creates these unmet needs of autonomy, connection, safety in an organization. And you get leaders trying to react with more command and control. And you have this kind of negative feedback loop going on here on the bureaucracy side of things. Or you can have the other side as well. So instead of reacting with command and control sort of behaviors, you have organizational leaders acting with avoidance. So not making decisions, not taking any sort of decisive action, which means that you are now creating an influence culture. So if you want to get anything done in an organization like this, it's all about who you know. Who can you get close to? What sort of pressure or relationships can you create that will help you get work done, because there's no actual process for doing anything, which doesn't give the team a bunch of autonomy. What it does is it makes teams quite inefficient and quite dependent on the relationships that they are, these informal relationships that they're able to build with leadership in an organization. And what most organizations do is just kind of bounce back and forth between these two cycles. So sometimes we were in that bureaucracy side, so now we then swing in an extreme way to the chaos side. We spend a lot of time in the chaos side. This isn't working. We need to bring some control to this. You swing to the bureaucracy side. And neither is a great place to be, and both result in this accruing of organizational debt over time. And I think where where this starts to, or where this comes from, I guess, is with these two very similar words. So complicated and complex. In just colloquial, everyday English, we often use these as synonyms. So something is complicated, something is complex. We're not generally differentiating between those two. But in systems theory, they are actually very different sorts of systems. So on the left-hand side, a complicated system, it's a system where the relationship between cause and effects requires analysis and expertise. Think of, you are a master mechanic and I bring you my broken car. you can analyze it. You can look at that system, and if you have the expertise, you know how to fix it. You can swap out parts, you can repair it, you can bring that system back to a working state. So things like any sort of mechanical system, a watch, an engine, things of that nature. A complex system, though, is a system where the relationship between cause and effect can really only be perceived in hindsight. So thinking about systems like the weather or traffic or growing a garden or raising a 6-year-old, these are complex systems. You can't kind of go out into the garden and analyze it the way you would a broken engine and be like, yep, I fixed the garden. It's all better now. It's going to be great now for the rest of the summer. No, you can go out and see what is going on. You can influence what is going on. You can improve things that are not working as well as you would hope, but it's not the same sort of knowable one-to-one causal relationship that you get with something like a watch or an engine. So on the left-hand side, the way you interact with the system is about sensing it, analyzing it, and then responding to it. And you can have a high degree of confidence that if you analyze it correctly, you'll fix the system. On the right-hand side, though, the complex system, it's more about probing, so interacting with the system, sensing how it responds to you, and then responding to that. And the reason I'm belaboring this point is that for too long, most people have thought of organizations as complicated systems. That's the legacy of the industrial era. In a time where we didn't have the internet, where we didn't have the communication tools we have now, where just the pace of change was not anywhere close to where it is right now, you could organize many organizations, maybe even most organizations, as these sort of complicated machines where we just had to go be smart about how we analyze it, and then we could swap people out interchangeably. We could improve the way the whole system works, and it does kind of work like an engine or a watch that we've repaired and made better. But I think as you look at organizations now, and as we have evolved out of the early 1900s, more and more organizations are not like complicated systems, and we can't bring those assumptions and beliefs about how those sort of systems work to our modern, creative, complex, ambiguous organizations and expect it to work particularly well. So one of the metaphors that we use then to try to bring new assumptions into how we think about organizations is that of the operating system. So you can think of the organization's operating system as the foundational beliefs, assumptions, principles, practices that shape our way of working. So the things that you see in your organization is that stuff above the soil, how people interact with each other, what meetings are like, just like what it feels like, what it looks like to be a member of an organization. That's the visible plant. But below the surface is the root system, is the operating system. And this is where the assumptions about how we do things in an organization, or what good even looks like or should feel like in our organization, that's where that stuff is happening. And if you aren't perceiving the root system, then you may think, if your plant is unhealthy, that I have to do things to the visible part of the plant. And yeah, sure, I'm starting to get outside of my comfort zone in terms of plant knowledge, but sure, you can do things like prune the leaves that are maybe dying, but that's not necessarily solving the actual cause of why the plant is unhealthy in the first place. If you want to improve the health of a plant, you got to look at the health of the soil. You got to figure out what the nutrient situation is there. Make sure the root system is okay. There's more you can do when you perceive the fact that there's a whole operating system happening below the surface. Same thing for our organizations. So let's talk about how operating systems can show up in various situations. So instead of talking about organizations, we're going to use this, which should be, I think, probably familiar to anybody who drives. So on the left-hand side, so what we have here is actually the exact same scenario for both. So both on the left and on the right, you have roads coming together in an intersection. And we need ways for people to safely navigate this intersection in their vehicle. But we have two different operating systems happening here. At least in the United States, the one on the left is far more common. The vast majority of intersections in the United States are operated with traffic lights. And in both of these situations, you can ask yourself, what do we assume about people and the problem in both operating systems? So on the left, we have some assumptions that basically people need to be told when it is safe to go through the intersection. We have assumptions that there will be electricity available at all times in the intersection. We have assumptions that we all kind of understand what the various colored lights mean, and we can trust each other to respond to those. And on the right, we have a very different sort of set of assumptions going on here. I mean, I think they can most easily be summed up as people will figure it out. As you are approaching a roundabout, you have to sense what is happening. Are there people already in the roundabout? Do I need to slow down? Do I need to yield? Do I understand the basic sort of rules that that allow a system like this to be operated? Excuse me. Both have their benefits and their downfalls, but in general, the one on the right is actually far better. I'm going to get to that in a second. So control and compliance is kind of the name of the game on the left, and trust and autonomy is kind of the name of the game for the one on the right. And if you think about objective measures that we should care about for intersections, things like fatal collisions, delays, which one has higher throughput, which one's cheaper to maintain, in almost every objective outcome, a roundabout, a traffic circle is much better than an intersection, than a traffic light intersection. And yet, as I said, in the United States, it's something like 85%, 90% of intersections are traffic lights. So the takeaway is not, well, let's go as quickly as we can and remove every traffic light intersection and replace it with a roundabout. That's obviously not the takeaway. More so, we should just be thinking, like, why do we have this? We have the option of an operating system that expects something different from what most of us expect when we are driving, and it's so much better, and yet we very rarely see them in our driving. And there's regional differences for sure. But let's think about organizations. So organizational operating systems, generally coming out of that industrial era set of assumptions, are based on control and compliance. We have managers that tell us what to do. We have a strict hierarchy where information flows from top to bottom. And as long as you follow the rules and the processes, then we'll be fine. We'll be good to go. However, there are a whole slew of organizations. Many have been around for a long time. And there's also this growing movement of organizations that are asking themselves, well, how can we have more of a roundabout sort of operating system? How can we have an operating system where we do have control and compliance where it matters most, but instead of defaulting to control and compliance, we default to trust and autonomy. If you default to trust and autonomy sort of operating systems, then you need to have a good reason to go to control and compliance, as opposed to the other way around, which is the way most organizations seem to think of themselves. So one way to try to shine a light into that black box that I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk is to use something like this, which is, we call it the operating system canvas. And all it is 12 different areas that all organizations have assumptions and practices and principles about how to do these things. So for purpose, how we orient and steer. How do we use purpose as an organizational level, but even at a team level? What's our assumption about the role purpose plays in our organization? Strategy, what does it mean for us to plan and prioritize? What are the rituals and practices and assumptions we have about what good strategy looks like for us? I'm not going to go through every single line or every single field here, but I will leave it up here for a second for you to just read about it. And as I said, these are just the 12 different areas where there are decisions to be made. And the benefit, I think, of a tool like this and the way that we've used it is that we suddenly have 12 or more when you start to look at these as pairs or as trios. You suddenly have so many levers for asking yourself, like, why are things not going as well as we would hope they were going? Or what could we do differently in these various areas, and how might that radiate across the organization? So when we looked at all of the organizations that seemed to be doing something differently, that had this kind of roundabout-based operating system, and we looked at their OS, their operating system canvas, we asked ourselves, well, what are they doing differently in these fields? Because if you'll notice on this OS canvas, there's no value placed on these. You could think of the most people negative, horrible place to work organization, and you could fill out like their assumptions and beliefs about these different things, and that would just be fine. That's how you use the OS canvas. The OS canvas doesn't tell you what to fill these fields with. This is what these two principles for us, that's the role that they play. So we see that organizations that seem to be doing really well from the kind of employee engagement side, but also really just thriving in this more complex environment, fill their OS canvas with more people positive and complexity conscious practices and principles and beliefs. So that people positive idea is that people are naturally motivated, capable of self-direction, and worthy of trust and respect. What it doesn't mean is that everybody is nice all the time, or that you can't give difficult or critical feedback to each other. It's not about that at all. This is about the fundamental assumptions we have about how people show up in their work. And then on the complexity conscious side of things, this is back to that complicated, complex sort of dichotomy. Practices that really honor the fact that we're dealing with complexity. And when you're dealing with complex systems, you really need to relax the idea that we can predict and control them to the degree that we might hope that we can. So complexity conscious practices are all about experimentation and iteration and seeing how the organization responds to the provocations that you introduce to it, and then responding to that in this iterative experimental way. So there are organizations that are doing all sorts of interesting things in these various areas. And what I would say is none of these organizations are like 100% perfect on any of this. There are aspects, and I'll talk more about this with an example that you all might be much more familiar with. There are aspects that are working really well for them. There are aspects that they are challenged with. And that's just to say there is no kind of one perfect operating system for all types of organizations. So one of the most cited case studies in this kind of new world of thinking about organizations in a different way it's Bert's.org. So it's a home nursing organization. They just have a really interesting story in the sense that they completely kind of changed their ways of operating when this new CEO came in, not new anymore, but when he first stepped into the job. Prior to the self-managed organization that they are now, they were like basically every other sort of home nursing organization in Europe, which was these nurses were really being tracked on how quickly and efficiently could they deliver the various treatments that they had to deliver to their patients. So it was all about how quickly do you get to your next patient, how little time can you spend there to administer the shots or the medicine or whatever it is that you needed to do. And if you think about the type of person who opts into being a nurse, to this caring profession, it was a profoundly discouraging sort of environment to be in. You don't become a nurse to see how many shots you can give in a day. You are there to care for people and to help them regain health or independence. And that was one of his insights when he came in as CEO, is that instead of trying to run this like a complicated machine where we are trying to be as efficient as possible, let's allow these regional teams of nurses to self-manage themselves. So they are responsible for an area, and then they figure out their scheduling, their approach to the work, so that they actually help their patients instead of just trying to crank through as many procedures in a day. So this organization now is built on these small self-managed teams of nurses who organize themselves and deliver the work. And you might think, well, yeah, it's a fun, like kind of feel-good story if, you know, financial returns don't matter. But the thing is, they are also the most successful organization in their industry as well. So when these self-managed teams of nurses are not just kind of wasting money, they have ownership over their costs and the way they deliver the work, and it's actually much more effective and efficient than the old kind of centrally planned way that they did their work. So an example that probably more familiar to many of you, given the industry, is Valve. I'll put the caveat on this as well, like I said for the last one, is that I'm not putting forth Valve as some sort of paragon perfect organization. I only put them forward because they are doing, well, first of all, it's kind of unequivocal that they are quite successful. And then they are also have done very interesting things in the past around their organization design. So kind of famous for the idea that when you are hired by Valve, there's nobody really telling you what to work on. You know, the phrase people are saying, like, your desk is on wheels and you got to go find stuff to work on. And the decisions they make about what they're going to work on are really around, well, what do people rally around? And, you know, from some of the research that I've done and people that I've talked to recently there's kind of like ebbs and flows around how much that is true at a given time. That's also to say that sometimes there are certainly downsides to this sort of more self-managed, amorphous way of organizing. People have some of the Glassdoor reviews and other things that I've talked to with people who have formerly worked there, is that it can sometimes feel quite cliquish, kind of like high school. Like it is kind of like a who you know on the org that thing. However, I just put them forward. If you haven't read the employee handbook from, I think, 2013, it's interesting. And they are, I think, bucking some kind of just basic assumptions about how organizations like themselves should be working. There are lots of other examples, by the way. So Brave New Work was written by Aaron Dignan, the founder of The Ready. And in that book, he has a bunch of different case studies of organizations that are just doing really radical things in the people positivity and complexity conscious side or buckets of organization design. So the takeaway here, I think, is that the future belongs to organizations who continually reinvent themselves. We no longer live in a world like the early 1900s where you can kind of figure out your competitive advantage and just grind that out for 50 years and make tons of profit. There's too much change happening in and around our organizations nowadays to just be one thing and just stay on that path forever. Organizations need to be able to sense and respond to what is happening out in the environment and be able to metabolize that into how they are structured, into how they function. To do that, though, I think we need to think differently about how organizations actually change. So traditionally, change efforts in organizations really pull from that complicated tool set. We'll go off, we'll analyze the system, we'll go make a new plan about the restructuring that needs to happen or the change, the transformation that needs to happen, and then we'll roll it out, we'll kind of cascade it to the whole organization. And as long as everybody follows our plan, then we'll be okay. If you've ever been a part of a change effort or a reorg in an organization, you know that it doesn't really work that way. What we have found works much better is that introducing change in small ways that can be somewhat unpredictable, but creates this scaling effect, this exponential change effect. So we talk about, instead of a traditional change effort, is often doing something non-radical at a very radical scale. So we're gonna make some relatively minor changes to how we do things here, but we're gonna roll it out to the entire organization all at once. Instead, flip that. What are radical things we can do at a non-radical scale? That sort of change seems to spread throughout organizations better, but it can't be predicted and controlled the way that the other one can. So by a radical thing at a non-radical scale, I mean, what can we do for a radical thing for a week, or a radical thing only within one team, or a radical thing where we will be ready to pivot away if it doesn't seem to be working. We can be more ambitious with our aspirations if we can take this experimental iterative approach to trying radical things within our organization. And the process for that is what we call the continuous participatory change loop, or just the loop. And it's like really any other learning loop. So it starts with this idea of organizational tension. So where in our organization are things just not working as well as they could be? What's stopping us from doing the best work of our life? Once we have a sense of the tension landscape, well, what are the things we could try? What practices are we aware of because we've used them in the past, or we used them at a previous job, or we read about them in a book, or we even just thought them up ourselves? What are practices that might address those tensions? And then can we take a sliver of that practice, or something that is inspired by that practice, and figure out what the radical change at non-radical experiment might be? So what will we actually try, introduce to our organization, actually do something different, and see how our system responds to it, which inevitably shines light on new tensions or new understandings of old tensions, which we just keep this practice going. And when you have a bunch of people, or a bunch of teams within an organization who have just incorporated this learning loop, this retrospective practice, into their ways of working, that's when you start to get really interesting change in organizations. You start in this kind of initial bounded spaces. We start to see some progress. It starts to spread and evolve. Someone who's not involved in the work starts to hear about, well, this other team, is raving about this new way that they're meeting, or how they feel so much clearer about their most important work, or other things like that. You start to get this word of mouth change, which then leads to this kind of exponential sort of viral change within a large organization. So I know we're coming right up on the end here, and I am not an expert in your industry. I have not worked specifically with a client in the gaming industry. Certainly played plenty of games in my life, but I will not pretend to say that makes me an expert in your industry. So I wanted to just close with some questions that I don't have answers to, but I think are relevant for you all as you either go back to your day job, or as you're looking for what you're going to do after school, or if you're going to start something or join something. These are the types of org design questions that I think there's a lot of juice in the squeeze of these. So first, in what direction will you influence the orgs you join or are already in right now? What are those experiments that you can introduce within your own sphere of influence, and how might you show up in a more people positive and complexity conscious way in your current roles? This is kind of pointing to the fact that it can feel like when you join a very large organization that you don't have enough influence or positional power to actually change that organization. And in many ways you don't. However, we all always have some locus of control, even if it's purely within our own team or within just how we show up as individuals, that can start to shift the dynamics within even very broken organizations. And then obviously, if you're in a position of leadership, you have a larger sphere of influence, and the way you show up and the ideas that you bring to your organization have a larger blast radius in a positive way. How are our assumptions about how organizations work holding us back? So are there aspects of the video game industry where we have kind of unthinkingly inherited assumptions from the industrial era? And are we okay with that? Or might there be assumptions that we can let go of, and new assumptions, new beliefs that we can bring into the organizations that we build for ourselves in the future? What is an organizational operating system specifically designed for making games look like? So this is connected to my previous point about, I think a lot of organizational stuff is inherited from the past and sometimes inherited in a way that is not helpful. So if you were going to create an OS from scratch with really no limitations, specifically designed to create the best games possible, how would you fill that OS canvas? What does good look like in your operating system to not have to worry about what you've inherited from the past? So what does it mean? What is the meeting culture like in an organization that is perfectly designed for making great games? What is the way we make decisions about resources, compensation, mastery? How do these things show up in a perfectly designed OS? And what might truly sustainable video game development look like? There's this idea that I first heard, I believe it was from Jason Fried from Basecamp, but he talked about how in most organizations, the actual process of doing work harms the organization. So like getting a product out the door, we then have to go into this period of like renewal and recovery because we've harmed lots of interpersonal relationships. We have maybe even harmed aspects of like the organizational structure in order to just get this thing out the door. And from my understanding of how your industry works, this is especially true. You know, the process of giving birth to a game sometimes destroys the studio in the process, or at least if it doesn't destroy it, at least weakens it. And does it have to be that way? What would it mean that the process of doing work actually strengthens the organization? So we actually get better every time we release something because we now have that experience. We now have stronger relationships because we've gone through something really hard together. And the next thing that we're able to do is more audacious and better because we're actually stronger, not we almost killed ourselves trying to finish this thing, and now maybe we'll be able to bring the band back together to do something else. I think it's a very interesting idea about what it would truly look like for something to be sustainable. And I know there are larger things at play in terms of, you know, relationships between publishers and studios that make things like this difficult, but I just offer it as a thing to think about. And then, you know, crunch is you know, famous, infamous in your industry. And I know there are defenders and opponents to the idea of whether or not crunch is inherent to what it means to make games. I wonder, you know, what would it mean you know, for crunch to not be inevitable? That it truly would be not the assumption, but something that we, you know, have to do only under the most rare of circumstances. And then just generally, what's the opportunity hidden in abandoning the status quo? You know, the organization like Bertsorg, it abandoned its status quo. It looked at its competitors and said, we don't have to do it exactly the same way. There's actually a better way for us to do this. Well, what other status quo within your industry can you let go of? And what advantages do you get from that? So how might changing your OS change the level of talent that is attracted to your organization? How might you stand out in a crowded industry if you've changed your OS? And how might working differently just simply unlock new levels of success, but, you know, require kind of that risk to step into a zone where it's a little bit unknown? So I'm going to leave you with this one last metaphor. I love metaphors for what we're talking about. We're talking about organizations. This is a guy doing the high jump, and probably in a way that you've never really seen someone do the high jump. Basically, before the way we are aware of it now, this is how people did it. Various versions of kind of running at the bar and then throwing yourself over it sort of sideways and feet first. And that's just the way everybody did it. Until this guy, who actually recently passed away, I think in the last year or two, Dick Fosbury, invented this new way of doing high jump, which just probably looks familiar to you because this is the way that literally everybody does it now. It just biomechanically is a better way for humans to jump very high, but it feels awkward to learn. And especially when he was the only one doing it, people looked at how he was doing it, which basically you turn your back to the bar and you go over head first. People are like, what is he doing? Like, that is bizarre. Like, I could never do it that way. And people originally thought, like, you know what, this is only something, this kind of freak of nature, only Dick can do this because like it's just something about him. but he taught it to his teammates, and eventually and quite quickly it became the only way people do high jump because it's just so much better. Organizationally, there's a lot of this going on. There's a lot of stuff that we just do because it's just the way we've always done it. From how we think about how we structure organizations, how we have meetings, how we compensate people, how we think about mastery. There's a lot of running at the bar and jumping at it sideways. And some organizations like Bertsorg, like Valve, like Morningstar, like lots of other ones in these interesting case studies are starting to realize there are better ways to do a lot of this. And it just takes a little bit of okay with being uncomfortable to unlock new ways of doing things. So I hope that gives you, like I said, probably didn't give you a bunch of answers, but hopefully gave you a bunch of questions that are interesting to you. And I really wish I was sitting in the room with you right now, because we would have all sorts of interesting conversations as soon as we finish up the talk here, and we could go chat about the things that you want to push back on or have more questions about. Unfortunately, we can't do that. However, I am very eager to receive email or tweets or posts from Blue Sky with anybody who watched this and wants to talk more. I am very willing and ready to have those conversations. So thank you very much for having me. And I'm really excited for you all to go out into the world and make better organizations and make great games that I'm very excited to play.